right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to From the Swamp to the States. It's Americans for Tax Reform's state policy focused podcast. We go around the 50 states to talk about the policies and politics that impact your wallet. And we are just a few weeks from November election day, and that means state ballot measures. So we got a lot of ballot measures to talk about. We'll be having a number of guests on to talk about ballot measures in their states and what you all can expect when you vote. And some people may be doing early voting. So certainly a timely topic. We're very pleased today to have Liz Patton with Americans for Prosperity in Kansas joining us. Hey, Liz, welcome to the show.
Wow, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about Kansas today.
Well, we're glad to have your expertise. And just a note for everybody, from the ATR perspective, we've released our 2022 state ballot guide. You can find that at atr.org/ballot guide, and it covers 18 states, 32 initiatives, amendments, questions across the country. So there's a lot going on. Kansas has a big one. And Liz, why don't you just start us off and explain a little bit of the background as to what happened there? Because there are a number of options in the legislature. So we've reached, we're very close to the end here, and we have one key measure we want to focus on. But let's give our audience a bit of a download on where we started and some of the amendments that were lost along the way.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting year here in Kansas. Coming into last legislative session, looking at a lot of opportunities that we had, knowing that, and I won't get into depth on this, but knowing that in the primary, not only did we have a contentious primary, but we also had another constitutional amendment on the ballot related to value them both, which was a pro-life measure on the August ballot. But that comes into play a little later, and I'll kind of try to give a holistic picture here, and feel free to jump in if you want me to go in a different direction. But this actually goes back a couple of years when we've tried over the years to find opportunities to make Kansas's regulatory structure within state government a little better. It's kind of a monster right now. And over the years, trying to make those statutory fixes, what came to light was our current Attorney General and now gubernatorial candidate, Derek Schmidt, helped identify this piece where the Supreme Court in Kansas in 1984 had made a ruling that essentially took away the ability for the legislature to have any accountability or ability to say, please stop, to a regulatory agency when they made a rule. And that's just eroding the balance of power as it was meant to be. So in Kansas, a government agency essentially through the right channels can make a rule or regulation, and the legislature can't do anything about it. Maybe they can pass a statute if they can get it passed. Sometimes that takes 2, 5, 7 years. There's no recourse. And these rules, as we know, have the power of law. So they're lawmaking with no accountability. So we had to pass a constitutional amendment, was what we decided to do, to give that the ultimate fix. And I can go into more of the why, but essentially we had to get 2/3 in both chambers and decided to put it on the November ballot, knowing that we had a contentious amendment in the August ballot. So we are on the general election with this one, but I do think that the dynamics of the amendment in August are having a pretty significant impact on the ballot, up and down the ballot in here in November.
That is interesting. And the amendment we're talking about is the Kansas Constitutional Amendment 1. So that would allow the legislature to have a check on the bureaucracy. So Liz, why don't I let you explain a little bit more about what the amendment does specifically, what people will be reading when they're going over this, because it's the language you see on the ballot is always
full of legalese.
A little unclear. It's not normal people talk.
It's not. And that's what's so hard. The ballot language that you're going to see on question 1 in the November ballot says something to the effect of the legislature will have the authority to make a procedure in order to change or review or basically stop a new rule or regulation coming in from the agency. So that's the gist of what you're voting on. And what we're trying to help people understand is that the way this is worded, This is not a power grab by the legislature. A lot of our opponents have said something to that effect, and I hate to repeat the narrative, but at the same time wanted to clarify that what it's doing is just allowing the legislature to do its job, and the job that most people think it's already doing, but it can't because of that Supreme Court ruling back in 1984. So all we're doing is allowing basically the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations, which already exists in Kansas. Right now, we're not even sure why they meet. They meet and the regulatory agency presents their regulation, and the legislators sit there and say either yes or that's terrible. And then if they don't like it, all they can do is write a mean note like they're in middle school and say, I don't like this. And that's the extent of their opportunity to combat a regulation that they think is overreach or red tape or outside of legislative intent. So we're trying just to give the Joint Committee on Rules and Regulations the ability to operate like a real committee and do their jobs the way they're supposed to.
And yeah, and you mentioned some of the attacks on it. I certainly have seen that, the idea that the legislature is overstepping the governor in executive power. I guess we're forgetting that the legislature is the entity that supposedly authorized all these regulators, but then once you're authorized it, then you're done. You're supposed to just sit on the sidelines and not care about what the entities you've authorized, what they do to your citizens and businesses. That
right. We don't want the legislature to cede their power over to unelected bureaucrats and say, we don't want to do our job. You guys need to do our job for us. And then they have no say over the laws in Kansas. That's not how we want our government to operate. And people think I saw something online where they said this takes away the veto power of the governor. Well, that's not true at all. So we definitely want to just make sure that the balance of power is correct in Kansas and is the way it's supposed to be working. And go figure, the legislative branch makes laws. That's what they're supposed to do. So we want to let them do that and be more involved in the regulatory process as well. We've got some silly ones on the books in Kansas, and they could have been prevented if we'd had something like this in place.
Yeah, and about where does Kansas rank in terms of regulatory environment, or are there particular problems that you see that can be tackled by this?
Yeah, I see three different things that I want to bring up. One thing is we all know is that regulations cost money, right? And so it costs money for the state government to create them, to enforce them. If a state legislature has to run a bill to combat those, each bill is $60,000 to $100,000. Last time I looked at the numbers to run, it costs consumers money because regulations raise costs on businesses, and then oftentimes that gets passed down to you and me. But we're also paying for it on the taxpayer end. So we see this as an opportunity to fight costs in our state government and get our budget under control. I think of Virginia, when they did some good red tape reform, they saw a pretty good budget improvement in their government, and I would like to see that replicated in Kansas with this amendment, in addition to some of the other regulatory reform we did last year. So hand in hand, that would be big. Kansas isn't the worst state holistically on the regulatory structure if you compare states to states pound for pound, but we do have a few agencies in particular that are a little more egregious than others and a little more aggressive than others in their rulemaking. And that looks at the two that are the highest in Kansas are the Kansas Corporation Commission, which directly impacts our energy costs. And number two is the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. They are the most highly regulated. But we're also looking at the Kansas banking industry, the Department of Ag. We're even looking at the Kansas Board of Cosmetology. They put a regulation in last year that the legislature couldn't stop that had the unintended consequence of shutting down tons of rural salons and salons in nursing homes. And so it's just things like that here and there, but holistically, I think it can make a huge improvement in people's livelihoods.
Well, that's a big one. When they pass that kind of rule without this in place, is there any recourse for people?
No, there's not unless the legislature passes a new statute. And so, people are like, well, they could pass a statute. But if you think about it, the rule goes into place. And by the time it goes into place, those are usually done. And then, we've got legislative session is only January to April every year in Kansas. We're a part-time legislature. So that's assuming that there's a bill that's filed at the right time. They can get it through committee and through the entire process and passed, which is very unlikely in the first year. By then it's already, the regulation is already in place. It's already being implemented, and then it probably won't pass that year. So it'll probably have to wait at least another year. And so we're looking at least 18 months minimum of any statutory change, especially if you think about it needing to go into the Kansas Register and being effective not until July, and just the delay on that. I mean, by then the damage is done.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who's joining late, we're talking about Kansas Constitutional Amendment 1, which is on the ballot this year, ballot question, should allow the legislature to have a check on the bureaucratic state and when they're going beyond the intent of the law. So an important measure here, especially for taxpayers and business owners in the state. And let's cover a little bit of the let's say, the scoring here, the sort of the play-by-play. We have a fight on this issue. We've talked about why it's needed, some of the counter arguments, but who's on the other side of this issue, and what are the prospects looking like at this point?
Largely on the other side of this issue, we've seen pieces of the Kansas Democratic Party mobilize, which is interesting because this was actually a bipartisan vote in the Kansas House of Representatives. And also there's a group called Keep Kansas Free, which in my opinion is a bit of a misnomer on their part. And they are coming at this particularly from a pro-choice perspective, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me, with the exception of them trying to tie this together with the amendment in August that was defeated. And it's really unfortunate because I think they are largely misunderstanding the regulation itself, or are seeing it just as a right of center play. And when it is truly, it doesn't matter who's in the governor's office. It doesn't matter who's in the legislature. Making sure we have the balance of power correct in Kansas is always important. So that's where we're seeing a lot of the opposition, and we're seeing that crop up, and they're getting the word out, and through a lot of grassroots effort on their end. And we want to make sure that Kansans understand the truth, and they understand that this is important. Some of our coalition partners were pretty wide ranged. We've got a lot of the Kansas agriculture industry on this with us. Kansas bankers were a great partner under the dome. The Kansas Chamber of Commerce, some energy partners. It just kind of runs a couple, just around different industries in our state, because for Kansas businesses and taxpayers, this matters a lot.
Yeah. Well, it feels like we have government able to do their own thing and expand their power, and they don't want to check on that power. And folks trying to put some accountability into place.
Right.
Which makes sense. There'd be some bipartisan support, but you don't always get that. So do we have any idea of what the prospects are looking like for this getting approved? I mean, of course, you mentioned the big issue in the summer, which is there's no obvious reason for it to be tied into this, but may have some impact. So what are things looking like on the ground?
Yeah, it's tough to tell. We are us at Americans for Prosperity. We've been knocking doors and doing a lot of work on our end related to some digital ads and some mail pieces to help educate voters, and trying to work on some earned media as well to educate as many people as possible. And I know some of our partners have been doing similar activities. And it's hard to tell because I think on one hand, the response at the door is incredible, right? People really want to see accountability and efficiency in their government. They want to see an opportunity to fight rising costs. In Forbes magazine, they did a story that said the number one thing that a state government can do to fight rising costs is get a handle on the regulatory regime. And that's what Kansas legislators are doing. They're being proactive to help fight rising costs. And people love that, and they want to increase accountability in our state. But it's definitely a battle, and I think a lot of times people's default is to just vote no on a constitutional amendment. But just want to assure people that this isn't done flippantly that this is a big deal. It is a big deal to amend our Constitution, but this makes a really significant and beneficial change for our state for years and years to come, to help us be a state where my kids can stay and be prosperous and have a great life here in Kansas.
It makes some sense, talking about the relationship between two branches of government, that it would require a constitutional amendment. Are there other reasons you want to make sure people are clear on as to why there needs to be a constitutional amendment here in particular, if you're seeing that kind of?
Yeah, I'll say this. So over the years, there have been a lot of attempts since 1984. There have been so many attempts in statute to make a fix like this. And it got down to the fact that we actually had the Mercatus Institute do a study on the Kansas regulatory body. We've got, about 3.5 million words, over 70,000 regs on the book in our state. That's a lot for a state like ours. But at the end of the day, the statutory fixes just continued to fall short. We've done a lot of things, like a kind of a REINS Act light in Kansas. We were one of 16 states that didn't have a compulsory review process to even look at outdated regulations. So we were working on that. It was difficult to get rid of regulations, so we wanted to make that fix. But at the end of the day, the missing piece was that accountability between getting it on the front end and eliminating some of this red tape and overreach right at the beginning, instead of letting it fester for years and years. And like I said, cause rising costs, impact businesses. The compliance for industries can be really burdensome, and basically to catch it and to the missing puzzle piece is what I call it, ended up being a constitutional amendment that gave that Joint Committee on Rules and Regs the opportunity to stop a bad regulation before it even gets in place. Because once it's already in place and done, it's just, like I explained earlier, it's a bit of a slog to try to undo the damage that it could do pretty quickly. So we want to make sure that we've right-sized that check right at the beginning and right at the source of the issue. So that's why it needed to be a constitutional amendment, because the Supreme Court essentially took away that power of in the legislature with that decision. That's what they said. They said the legislature can't tell the unelected bureaucrats, the government agencies, that the law, not to write laws. and that's not really what we're looking at. We're not saying that they can't do their jobs and be regulators, but what we are saying is the legislature should have the ability to say, pause if the regulation seems out of balance with what they want for our state, or not complying with the legislative intent of a new law. In Kansas, a lot of times what they'll do, and I'm sure it's in other states, where they'll write what we call an enabling clause. And so it basically directs the government agency to create regulations around something. But so many times that enabling clause ends up being, is what it is. But then, the legislature, when they create the regulations and they come back and say, here, this is what we did. But if it's not at all what the legislature wanted or hoped with that policy, like I said, there's nothing that can be done. It's over. So there's no back and forth, no opportunity to get that fixed. And that's really why this has to be a constitutional amendment to get that changed. We've tried. Like I said, Attorney General Derek Schmidt wrote this back in, probably 2020 at this point, when we identified that being the missing link, the missing puzzle piece, the missing puzzle piece. But, and people are trying to politicize it because he is also currently running for governor in Kansas. But he came up with this as an attorney general before that was even on his mind, thinking through the fact that the attorney general's office in Kansas, they're the ones who are very involved in the regulatory process and approving the regs. But he saw this as an issue years ago, and this is what needs to be done. But no, I know it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to agree to amend the Constitution, but it's needed. It's very needed in Kansas.
I imagine people assume that the Regulatory Oversight Committee has some ability to oversee regulations, so maybe pointing that out to realize something does need to be done. This is I have to laugh. There's one of the gals that ran this amendment. She's a
former chair of the committee, the Joint Committee on Rules and Regs, and that's the Regulatory Oversight Committee. And she laughs. She's like, I'm not sure why we meet. We sit there and they talk to us about the regulations, but that's it. There's nothing we can do. So there is no actual teeth to that committee. The Regulatory Oversight Committee, it can do nothing. And I don't think people realize that. They see the Joint Committee on Rules and Regs as an oversight committee, but it's not. It's not an oversight committee. Not in the way that it's functional. And that's what we need to be changing. That's what we're changing. And absolutely needs to be done so that can operate like an actual committee and do the job it's supposed to be doing.
Absolutely. Well, clearly there's a relationship there that's broken. We've lost that accountability between the legislature and the regulatory state. So very interesting to see this on the ballot. It could make a big difference for Kansas. Again, I'll remind folks they can check out our ballot guide, atr.org/ballot guide, which covers this and a number of other measures. Liz, thanks so much for joining us. What do folks need to know before we let you go, and where can they find AFP Kansas and more information about the good work you all are doing?
Absolutely. Find us on Twitter at AFPKAS. Find us on Facebook. We have a lot of good information there. We're also on Instagram. We have plenty of opportunities there to get involved with what we're doing with this and a lot of other things. But ultimately, we want to just remind everybody when they go to the ballot in November or even right now for early voting that they say yes to Kansas and they say yes, Kansas on question 1 and vote to make sure that the legislature can do its job.
Okay, great. Well, very much appreciate you joining us. It was great to talk to you. Thank you for kicking off our podcast series here where we talk about some of the key ballot measures out there. So very much hope to have you back in the future, and good luck in Kansas.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.